Why does Venezuela appear in American confidential documents decades before it became a global concern? Why would a country once considered stable quietly participate in strategic war simulations in Washington? What led U.S. military planners to connect Venezuela to decisions rooted in World War II? Was it coincidence or foresight? What if the greatest victory of the United States had planted the seeds of a plan that would only reveal itself there? What if everything you were taught about victory was only the surface? What if the wars the United States won were not the end of the story, but the beginning of a much longer one? What if the most powerful military force ever assembled did not merely defeat enemies on the battlefield, but also reshaped the future in silence? What if World War II never truly ended? It simply changed uniforms, borders, and methods. When American bombers crossed the skies of Europe, they did not carry only firepower. They carried strategy, vision, control. And when the Cold War began, was it really a war of ideologies, or a calculated extension of an American victory the world was never meant to fully understand? Ask yourself, why did the United States, after saving the world from collapse, continue to build the most advanced military machine in the history of mankind, long after the enemy had disappeared? Why were secret projects buried, files sealed, and operations spread across continents under names no one remembers anymore? And why, decades later, does Venezuela appear in documents that were never meant to come to light? Was the greatest strength of the United States never just its weaponry, but its ability to foresee decades ahead? To wage wars not only with armies, but with patience, positioning, and power held back until the perfect moment? Because history teaches us that when chaos takes hold, the United States does not retreat. It intervenes, it stabilizes, it saves. But what if saving the world required decisions so complex, so far-reaching, that even victory had to be kept secret? What if the greatest strategic operation in American history had begun in 1943, evolved during the Cold War, and was only now reaching its final phase? Tonight, we open a confidential chapter, not to question America's strength, but to understand the true depth of that strength. Because some victories are thunderous, and others are still unfolding. If the United States won World War II, why did silence come so soon afterward? Why, after liberating Europe, halting totalitarian expansion, and becoming the pillar of the reconstruction of the free world, did America begin to act as if it was still at war? In 1945, the planet breathed a sigh of relief. The flags were raised, the soldiers returned home, and the world began to call the United States saviors. And they were. But inside closed rooms, far from cameras, far from speeches and medals, the maps were not put away. They were redrawn, because the American victory was not only military, it was strategic, it was intellectual, it was historical. The United States did not only defeat the enemy, they learned from it. They learned how the world almost fell, and they decided that this would never happen again, even if the world never knew how. While most of the population saw the war as tanks against tanks, ships against ships, men against men, Washington was already thinking in decades, not in battles. The B-17 bombers that crossed the skies of Europe carried more than bombs. They carried clear messages. America had awakened, and when it awakened, it did not retreat. Each base built, each air route, each logistical advance was a silent lesson for the future. The war taught American strategists something essential. True power is not only in winning today, but in preventing anyone from winning tomorrow. That was where the unofficial doctrine was born. Never written, never signed, but strictly followed. The doctrine of total anticipation. When Germany fell, a dilemma emerged. The world needed reconstruction, but America needed guarantees, because leaders in Washington knew something few were willing to hear. Chaos always finds a new form, and if the enemy no longer came wearing visible uniforms, it would come through ideas. That was how the Cold War began, before it even received a name. Not as an open conflict, but as a global chess game where the United States played white, always making the first move. When the Central Intelligence Agency was created, the public believed it would serve to gather information. That was true, but it was not everything. The CIA was born to prevent the collapse of the free world, even if that required invisible decisions. Because the mistake of the 1930s was painfully clear. The world acted too late. America would not make the same mistake twice. While the Soviet Union expanded its influence, the United States expanded something even more powerful. Silent strategic presence, bases, agreements, trade routes, discreet support. Nothing was random, nothing was impulsive. The American victory had created a responsibility greater than any medal, to keep the world standing. During the Cold War, the fear was not nuclear bombs. The real fear was something else. What if a new collapse began far from Europe? What if it emerged in regions considered secondary? What if the next conflict did not come with tanks, but with instability, scarcity, and narratives? That was when America began to look south, not as conquest, but as anticipated protection. Latin America was not a battlefield. It was a thermometer, and some countries drew too much attention. There are records that do not speak of war. They speak of potential. Reports that analyzed natural resources, geographic positions, maritime routes, political influence. Among them, one name appeared with increasing frequency over the decades: Venezuela. Not because of ideology, not because of direct conflict, but because of location, because of energy wealth, because it was a piece that, in the wrong hands, could destabilize an entire hemisphere. The United States did not see Venezuela as a threat. They saw it as a future responsibility. Because when a superpower wins, it becomes responsible for what has not yet happened. While the world slept under a false sense of peace, American strategists were working, not to dominate, but to prevent the worst. This is the part of history that is rarely told, the part where saving the world does not mean applause. It means carrying the weight of decisions that can never be explained. Because some victories must remain silent, and some plans only make sense when the right time arrives. Long pause, because what began in World War II did not end in the Cold War. It merely entered a holding pattern. And when the world began to change once again, America was already there, watching, calculating, prepared. The Cold War was never about who would press the button first. That was what the public saw. That was what newspapers sold. The real war took place in windowless rooms where maps mattered more than speeches and silence was worth more than threats. The United States had learned a definitive lesson in World War II. Those who react late lose everything. That is why, during the Cold War, America did not wait. It anticipated. While the Soviet Union sought to expand its ideological influence, the United States responded with something more sophisticated. Not just weapons, not only military alliances, but a global architecture of power. Every American base overseas had a purpose. Every agreement had multiple layers. Every diplomatic gesture concealed a strategic equation. The objective was simple and at the same time monumental: to ensure that no hostile force could ever destabilize the free world again. The American victory could not be episodic. It needed to be permanent. In the 1950s, Washington was no longer thinking in isolated countries. It was thinking in entire regions. Europe stabilized, Asia monitored, the Middle East observed. But there was one area that demanded silent and constant attention: the Western Hemisphere, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. If chaos emerged close to home, the impact would be immediate, and it was there that reports began to multiply. Reports that did not speak of imminent wars, but of future possibilities. Among them, a pattern began to emerge. In the 1960s, Venezuela was not an international headline. It was not a battlefield. It was not an ideological focus. It was something more dangerous. It was too stable, too rich, too strategic. With one of the largest energy reserves on the planet and a geographic position that connected the Caribbean, South America, and vital maritime routes, Venezuela began to be seen not as a problem, but as a point of balance. And points of balance, when broken, cause earthquakes. American strategists knew this. That is why Venezuela entered the scenarios, not as an enemy, but as a key piece to be protected, or, if necessary, preventively neutralized. The memory of the 1930s was still alive. At that time, the world ignored clear signs of collapse. America hesitated, and the price was global. During the Cold War, that hesitation would not exist. If a region showed signs of future instability, it would be studied, monitored, prepared. Venezuela was not the problem. The problem was what could emerge from it if external forces influenced its destiny. And Washington knew exactly which forces could attempt that. Not all operations have famous code names. Some are never officially recorded. They are made of meetings, of parallel reports, of decisions that never reach Congress. These operations did not seek direct control. They sought predictability. Because for the United States, the true enemy has always been surprise, and Venezuela silently began to be observed as a point where surprise could not be allowed to happen. American military superiority during the Cold War did not serve only to fight. It served to deter. Aircraft carriers did not need to fire. Bombers did not need to take off. The mere existence of American power maintained balance, and that balance saved the world more times than history admits. While the planet lived under the nuclear threat, it was American decisions, firm, calculated, and often invisible, that prevented collapse. This was the silent victory. At the end of the Cold War, many believed that history had ended, that the world was finally safe, that the threat had disappeared. But in Washington, no one thought that way. Because empires do not fall only with tanks, they fall with vacuums. And every vacuum is an invitation. The question was not whether something would emerge, but where. And some old reports began to be reopened. Reports that mentioned a specific country, a country that now appeared with uncomfortable frequency: Venezuela. When the Cold War ended, the world celebrated. Walls fell. Flags were put away, and many believed that the greatest threat of modern history had finally been overcome. For the public, it was the end of an era. For the United States, it was only a transition, because America never confused victory with rest. In the 1990s, an idea began to circulate strongly: the idea that the world had learned, that major conflicts would not repeat themselves, that the global order was consolidated. But inside the Pentagon, the CIA, and Washington's strategic centers, That narrative was never fully accepted. History does not end. It changes shape. And the greatest threat does not arise when the world is on alert, but when it believes it is safe. It was at that moment that America began to observe something dangerous, the weakening of global vigilance. For decades, American military power was explicit, visible, indisputable. But after the end of the Cold War, the strategy evolved. Fewer tanks on display, more intelligence, more silent monitoring. American strength did not diminish. It was refined. Satellites replaced trenches. Data replaced entire divisions. Anticipation replaced reaction. And it was in this new scenario that old strategic points returned to the table. Among them, Venezuela. During the Cold War, Latin America was observed with caution. After it, many believed it was no longer a priority. That was a mistake. Dangerous. Because stability is not permanent. It needs to be sustained. And some countries, when they stop being observed, become vulnerable to external influences. Venezuela, with its privileged geographic position and critical energy resources, never disappeared from American maps. It simply left the spotlight. But in the archives, it remained underlined. By the end of the 1990s, reports began to change tone. They no longer spoke only of potential. They spoke of trends, political instability, populist narratives, the approach of external actors to the hemisphere. None of this was immediate. None of this was explosive. But American strategists knew great collapses begin this way, slowly, disguised as normality, and Venezuela shifted from a point of balance to a zone of growing attention. The United States never sought to be the world's police, but the world repeatedly turned to America when everything threatened to collapse. Because when crises emerge, nations do not look for speeches, they look for capability. And no nation developed greater strategic response capability than the United States. That responsibility was not chosen. It was inherited through victory. While headlines focused on other regions, Washington observed. Without fanfare, without announcements. Because acting too early creates resistance. Acting too late creates chaos. True strength lies in knowing when to act. And the signs were accumulating. Venezuela was no longer just a resource-rich country. It was a point where global interests were beginning to converge. And when interests converge, risk increases. The global public did not notice, but America did, because its analysts do not look only at the present. They project scenarios. And some of those scenarios, written years earlier, now appeared uncomfortably accurate. The question was no longer if something would happen. It was how to prevent the impact from becoming irreversible. Because when the world lowered its guard, the United States kept theirs firm. Not out of paranoia, but out of experience. And American experience taught something simple. Crises do not announce their arrival. They insinuate themselves, and when they finally reveal themselves, only one nation is usually ready to contain them. The 21st century did not begin with tanks in the streets. It began with subtle signals, discreet agreements, unexpected presences. While the world distracted itself with the idea of a new era of peace, old forces began to move again, not with raised flags, but with influence. And the United States noticed first, because when a superpower wins a global war, it learns to recognize the patterns that precede the next one. In the New World Order, distance ceased to be protection. What happens in one country can echo across entire continents. And Venezuela, located at a strategic point in the Western Hemisphere, began to attract attention that did not come from the north. It came from outside, from very far away, forces that saw instability as opportunity, that viewed resources as leverage, and fragile governments as open doors. None of this went unnoticed in Washington. The response of the United States was never impulsive. It was calibrated. Modern American doctrine does not seek unnecessary direct confrontations. It seeks balance of power, presence without provocation, strength without exhibitionism, capability without explicit threat. Because true deterrence is not about speaking loudly, but about being impossible to ignore. And once again, Venezuela entered the scenarios, not as a target, but as a point of strategic containment. For the United States, the Western Hemisphere has always been more than a region. It is a security line. When external influences attempt to establish themselves there, the risk ceases to be local. It becomes global. And the files show that Venezuela began to appear in joint analyses: energy, maritime routes, regional stability. There was no panic. There was method. Because America does not react to headlines. It reacts to trends. While some interpret American presence as intervention, strategists know the truth. Where America remains vigilant, conflicts rarely escalate beyond control. Aircraft carriers are not instruments of immediate war. They are floating messages of stability. Bases are not threats. They are guarantees. And this posture has saved the world more times than books record. In protected rooms, far from public opinion, simulations began to include specific scenarios, and all of them started from the same premise. What if the balance is broken here? The answers did not involve invasions. They involved containment, strategic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, isolation of external influences, modern tools for modern wars. Because America learned that winning does not mean destroying. It means preventing destruction from happening. Being the world's leading power is not a comfortable privilege. It is a burden. Every decision affects millions. Every omission can cost generations. And when Venezuela began to move closer, dangerously close to a breaking point, the United States did not have the option to ignore it. Ignoring was never part of American doctrine. While analysts debated narratives, Washington evaluated real capabilities. Who benefits from chaos? Who loses with stability? Who gains from the weakening of the hemisphere? These questions always had clear answers. And that is why, once again, America assumed the role it has always assumed since 1945, that of anchor of the international system. Because when the board begins to move again, only those who have known the game since the beginning can anticipate the next move. And the United States knows this game better than any other nation, not because it sought this role, but because it won when the world needed it most. There is a fundamental difference between a war and a plan. Wars end. Plans evolve. And while the world insisted on believing that history had turned the page, the United States knew the truth. Great threats do not disappear. They only learn how to wait. In recent years, old documents began to make sense again. Reports typed on typewriters, maps drawn by hand, simulations that seemed exaggerated for their time, but nothing there was fantasy. And many of those files, curiously, mentioned the same strategic points, the same routes, the same risks. Venezuela, a name that crossed decades without making noise, always present, always observed, as if someone, long before the world realized it, already knew that this point would return to the center of history. The United States did not win the Second World War only with military force. They won with vision, with the ability to look beyond the smoke of the present and see what the world could become, for good or for collapse. That mindset was never abandoned. It was passed from generation to generation within American institutions, because those who saved the world once learned that they may need to save it again. True power is not in acting all the time. It is in knowing when to act. And for decades, America chose to contain, balance, wait. Not out of weakness, but out of responsibility. Because every American move carries global weight. And when the United States moves, the entire world feels it. And what if all of this was never improvisation? What if the connection between the Second World War, the Cold War, and current events in Venezuela is just another chapter of a continuous strategy? What if the greatest mistake is believing this is the end, when, in fact, it is only the visible phase of something much larger? Because some stories are not told all at once. They are revealed little by little, when the world is ready to listen. If you have made it this far, understand one thing. None of this is coincidence within this story. Every decision has a root. Every event has a precedent. And every silence has a reason. The question is not whether there are still more chapters. The question is, how many still remain hidden? If you want to continue exploring the stories that were never explained, the files that time tried to hide, and the decisions that shaped the modern world, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, because in the next episode, we will open